did a couple days to do this, and I know it got released on Sunday, but the reason I like to wait a little bit longer is because I really try on this show as much as I can to bring unique angles and perspectives going into whatever topic that I'm talking about. Because I know you, whether it's ESPN or whoever you follow, it tends to be a lot of the same sort of narratives in terms of, well, the narrative for this year obviously is the debate between SMU and Alabama. And, I'll be the first one to tell you again that the committee got it right. SMU should be over Alabama. If Alabama just took care of business, even just versus Oklahoma, we wouldn't be having this debate. I would still argue that Alabama would probably deserve to be in over SMU if they took care of Oklahoma. But in terms of this college football playoff, I think the angle that I want to kind of take this from is also the fact that I'm happy that conference championships still matter, because I think if SMU didn't get in and if they only lost by 3 points, I think that would also tell schools again that conference championships wouldn't matter anymore. So I am glad that you were essentially rewarded for even getting to that spot, because it's easy to sit there and talk about what happens after these games happen. But I think the committee really prioritized talking about where you were at the time of these games. And especially when you go back and look at resumes compared to now and before, a lot of people only tend to view it within the lens of right now, not in the lens of back in August or back in September. I mean, even Georgia Tech and Florida State, it's a great example. When Georgia Tech beat Florida State at the beginning of the year, everybody was talking about how Florida State shit the bed in their top 10 team. And now now we only can tell what's going to come from here, especially after the Boston College game too. And now that they finished 2-10, it's like that. It's like those games almost don't even matter anymore, because now that they're 2-10, it's like, okay, well, that's just kind of the team that they are, even though at the time they were viewed way differently. But in terms of this college football playoff and the seeding and the rankings, there are two main things that I think really kind of have to be touched upon that I don't think other people are either talking about as much or, quite frankly, gets overlooked. I would say number one, most importantly, is there's too many there's too many damn teams. I think this year really showed just how many teams that there are. And I would argue that, yes, there is a time and a place for experimentation in college football, because I agree that the only way to know is by finding out. So let's, it's okay to try something and it not work out. But I think what ends up happening here is a couple different things. First off, the top four seeds of the conference championships getting the bye. I'm not necessarily opposed to teams getting a bye necessarily, but I think what it might be, maybe the quick tweak to it would be if the top four conference champions still get in, which I'm for that. But how about instead of it being seeded 1 to 4, how about they at least automatically get a top 8 seed? I think that would be a fair compromise, in the sense of you're still getting rewarded for winning the college football for winning your conference championship and being in the playoff, but at the same time you're not having to sit there and have the questions of, well, Boise State and Arizona State are ranked over Notre Dame, Ohio State, Penn State, and Texas. So that's the first. I think that's the first criticism that I think could be kind of tweaked in that regard, because if you're mainly watching the power four schools, the first thing you're kind of saying to yourself is, okay, Boise State and Arizona State are just going to get creamed for their path to the semifinal. I think that's what a lot of people would generally say, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you whether that's going to happen or not. I don't know who's playing, but I think that's one angle that you can take this from, in the sense of, if there were only 4 teams or 8 teams, which is what I would propose, we wouldn't have to sit here and have these conversations. I mean, yeah, you're going to have the one outlier team who could have sort of their Cinderella story or their moment or whatever. This year, obviously, the example would be Boise State. And if you tweaked it back to eight teams, I think you would have much more success in terms of your bowl games mattering too, because that's another angle of this that you can take it from too, is the aspect of you're still worrying about the whole bowl game system, and you're worried about the transfer portal as well, which is a whole nother conversation. But to me, this whole thing showed that there's just too many teams in the playoff, because the reality is, yes, Clemson got in because they won their conference championship, which happens sometimes, and even in the NFL, you can talk about teams who have gotten to the playoff with losing records. For example, Seattle Seahawks back in 2011 or 2012 when they beat the Saints. I don't remember what year that was, but that was the first one that kind of came to mind too. But it definitely to me shows that, because the reality is, the more teams that are in it, the less it matters that you actually got in, and the more margin for error, let's say, that you can have. Because I would sit there and argue that Notre Dame, Ohio State, and Tennessee, and I might even go as far to say Indiana. I would have to sit down and think about it for another second, but I would argue those teams together have a better resumes than Texas and Penn State, and Texas and Penn State are ranked fifth and sixth. So it's like, yes, I think that's kind of the catch-22 that you're trying to find is, well, if you're Alabama, I mean, even Greg Burns said, hey, we're going to reevaluate our non-conference schedule, even though the reason you didn't get in was because of your conference play. So that was kind of ironic that he talked about that too. But moving forward, I'm fascinated to see how larger programs are going to view their non-conference scheduling. I think in maybe 4 to 6 months from now, you're going to see a lot more teams canceling some of the easy sort of the easy sort of FCS games, or for example, Alabama, they played Western Kentucky, South Florida, and Mercer as their three non-conference games. So it's like, what's the point even playing a non-conference game? You're sitting there. I'm not saying you have to throw Notre Dame in there every year, but I mean, could you throw at least a dog, like someone in the Big Ten? Like could you throw an Illinois in there, or someone who can actually somewhat put up a fight against them? So it's a mix of the seeding showing that, one, I would argue that there's too many teams, but two, I think what you're going to be missing from having this sort of seeding situation is, the more you have these seeding sort of situations, the less your strength of schedule is going to matter. And what I mean by that is, when you have a situation where you can argue, because this year it was a little bit more clean cut compared to last season. So I think in some regard, because the SMU and Clemson game was so close, it was a lot easier for the committee to figure out who was going to get in and who wasn't. But if SMU, let's say they got spanked by Clemson, I think that's when the conversation would have been a lot different in terms of what should it be, SMU or Alabama. I'm not even talking about Ole Miss and South Carolina, because I think objectively speaking, the Ole Miss and South Carolina didn't even have an argument in terms of my opinion. But I think that's really the balance that you're going to try to find is, you have to prop up your strength of schedule a little bit, but at the same time, the one thing that I did see in terms of this ranking is that your quality of losses mattered, where you've been seated consistently matters, and it matters in terms of your conference play in general. And I've said this over and over again on the show, and I'll continue to say it: winning your conference championship needs to matter. Winning conference games need to matter, and you should get rewarded from that. And that's exactly what Georgia did, beating Texas too, without Carson Beck for the entire second half. And that was definitely one of the best games I've watched in a long time, in the sense it was just such a back and forth affair. But the other element I want to bring up in terms of this college football playoff is, I mentioned that I think before it there should be too many teams. I've mentioned that luckily the conference championship, attendees won't get hurt. I mean, I think it kind of just worked out that nobody got hurt, even though I think if we're talking about 2025, it could be definitely sort of catastrophic if a couple of results ended up different too. But the other aspect I want to bring up in terms of the college football playoff is how much, as teams kind of figure out how the committee's thinking, or in terms of how the auto bids can be moving forward. The other concern that you have that I think this sort of seeding could set up is teams kind of manipulating certain outcomes, or playing in certain scenarios in order to get kind of a one up in certain regards, because it was announced too that SMU got in over Alabama about an hour before it got released. And that's definitely a big problem in terms of keeping the integrity of the game in check. And as these situations keep coming up, I think if those things don't get nipped sooner than later, you're going to have an issue where insider people are going to figure out where the committee's at in their head, and that could disrupt how games are being played ultimately. I mean, even a lot of SEC coaches such as Lane Kiffin and Kirby Smart have kind of hinted at to what extent does the conference championship really matter? I mean, obviously they're going to tell the media that yeah, it matters, yeah, they want to win, all of that stuff, but at the end of the day, it comes down to what you see on the field. So ultimately, it's great that the conference championships matter. It's great that nobody seriously got hurt from it. But at the same time, there is going to have to be a conversation of and again, I'm not an SEC homer. I'm not a Big Ten homer. I try to cover as much as I can on this show. But at the same time, when you're looking at it resume from resume, you can definitely make an argument that the strength of schedule is probably not being prioritized as much as it should, in the sense of, Texas and Penn State. If you look at all their wins, the majority of them aren't really ranked teams and weren't super impressive. Now, granted, Penn State's two losses were to Oregon in the Big Ten championship game in Ohio State, so you can sort of give them a pass there. But even when you look at Texas, I mean, one of their most impressive wins of the year was against Kentucky, and then they lost to Georgia, twice. So it's like, I guess it's kind of the catch-22. But at the same time, it shows that I don't think the playoff system is necessarily broken, but I think what this proved in terms of that going into this year and next year is that it definitely needs to be tweaked, but they are heading in the right direction. And if you know you're gonna keep it at 12 teams and probably are only gonna do more, you're gonna have to definitely kind of flirt with in terms of what's going to work in terms of automatic bids, and to what extent should we keep adding teams on, because at the end of the day, it's only going to delegitimize what you have in terms of the college football playoff, because at the end of the day, you have to find a balance between the playoff actually mattering versus the actual best teams to get in, but also sitting there and saying that, you can even translate this to all sorts of different sports leagues, that the reality is that the more teams that you add in, the less that matters.